I thought love was supposed to protect me, but instead, it destroyed me. The man I trusted with my heart, the one who whispered promises of forever, had done the unthinkable. One moment, I was in my home, safe and unaware, and the next, I was in handcuffs, being dragged away like a criminal. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night as I stood frozen at my doorstep, my wrists locked in cold steel. My mind refused to process what was happening. The voices of the officers blurred together, their words hitting me like distant echoes. Fraud, money laundering, identity theft. My name was attached to crimes I didn't commit. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Any second now, someone would step in and fix this. But no one did. My neighbours stood in their doorways, their eyes filled with shock and judgment. The whispers had already started, their pity and curiosity stabbing deeper than any words could. I opened my mouth to protest, but nothing came out. My breath was trapped in my throat, my pulse racing so fast it made me dizzy. And then, as I was shoved into the back of the police car, the real horror hit me. Only one person had access to everything. My finances, my personal information, my life. Only one person could have done this. Daniel, the man I loved, the man I would have given my life for. He had framed me. And as the car pulled away, I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. The car moved through the city, but I barely noticed the streets passing by. My mind was trapped in a loop, replaying the last few months, searching for something, anything that could explain how I ended up here. The officers sat in silence, their faces unreadable, treating me like just another criminal. I wanted to scream, to beg them to believe me, but my throat was dry and my body felt too weak to fight. Daniel's face flashed in my mind. His smile, his touch, the way he had looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. Was any of it real? Or had he been planning this all along? My stomach twisted as I thought about the nights he held me close, whispering how much he loved me. The words that once felt like home now felt like poison. I thought back to the times I had brushed off little things, the mysterious phone calls he'd step away to take, the nights he had come home later than usual, claiming work kept him busy, the papers he had me sign without question because, as he had said, trust is the foundation of love. And I had trusted him, foolishly, blindly. The car jerked to a stop in front of a police station. The doors opened and hands pulled me out roughly. My legs felt shaky as I stepped onto the cold pavement, my mind still struggling to catch up with reality. Inside, the bright lights burned my eyes as I was led down a hallway filled with officers who barely spared me a glance. Just another case. Just another person whose life was about to be torn apart. They sat me down in an interrogation room, the walls grey and suffocating. A single chair, a table, a large mirror that I knew was one-sided. Someone was watching me from the other side, judging me, deciding my fate before I even had a chance to explain. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I wasn't sure. Then the door creaked open, and a detective stepped inside. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as he dropped a folder onto the table and slid into the chair across from me. "Emma Carter," he said, flipping open the file. "You have a lot to answer for." "I didn't do this," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. He ignored me, pulling out a stack of papers. "Bank records, forged signatures, evidence tying you to stolen money." He tapped the documents with his fingers. "This all points to you." I shook my head violently. "No, I don't even recognize those transactions. I never signed anything." The detective leaned back, watching me. "Then explain how your name is on every piece of evidence we found." My mind raced. This was impossible. I had never taken money, never opened fraudulent accounts. But then I remembered. Daniel had access to my documents. He knew my passwords. He could copy my signature. And that's when the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had planned everything. Every sweet moment, every carefully placed compliment, every act of love. It had all been a setup. He hadn't just framed me. He had used me. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to cry. Crying wouldn't help me now. I needed to think. I needed to prove my innocence. I took a shaky breath and looked the detective in the eye. I didn't do this, I repeated, stronger this time. But I know who did. The detective didn't react immediately. He just stared at me, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His silence was suffocating, stretching between us like an invisible wall. I could feel him studying me, trying to decide whether I was lying or telling the truth. "Who?" he finally asked, his voice neutral but firm. I swallowed hard. Saying Daniel's name felt like a betrayal. But then I reminded myself, he had already betrayed me. "Daniel Reeves," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "He's the one who did this." The detective raised an eyebrow, flipping through the papers in front of him. "Daniel Reeves? Your boyfriend?" I flinched at the word. Boyfriend. It sounded wrong now, like it belonged to someone else's story. "Yes," I answered. "He had access to my accounts, my personal information. He could have forged my signature on anything." The detective leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You're saying he framed you?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I know how it sounds, but you have to believe me. He's the only person who could have pulled this off." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're right about one thing, Emma. It does sound unbelievable. A successful businessman framing his own girlfriend? Why would he do that?" I clenched my fists under the table. "I don't know yet, but I swear on my life I didn't commit these crimes." The detective leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't convinced. I could see it in his eyes. To him, I was just another suspect, another liar trying to squirm my way out of a conviction. "You have no proof," he said, almost sounding bored. "Everything in this file points to you. If Daniel set you up, where's the evidence?" My stomach twisted. He was right. I had nothing. No messages, no recordings, no witnesses. The only person who could prove my innocence was the man who had set me up in the first place. My mind raced. Think, Emma. Think. Then it hit me. "There's something," I said, my pulse quickening. "Daniel made me sign documents before. I never questioned them because I trusted him. What if—" I took a deep breath, my words tumbling out in a rush. What if those were the forged documents? What if I was signing things without realizing what they were? The detective's eyes narrowed. He didn't respond right away, but I saw the tiniest flicker of interest. He was listening now. "I need a phone call," I blurted out. "Please, just one." He sighed, tapping his fingers against the table again. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room. I slumped in my chair, my body drained of energy. My mind was spinning. I had no idea who to call, no idea what my next move should be. But I had to act fast. I knew one thing for sure. If Daniel had gone this far to frame me, he wouldn't just sit back and wait. He was already covering his tracks. The door slammed shut behind the detective, leaving me alone in the cold, sterile room. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like 1,000 bricks. I had spoken Daniel's name. I had thrown him into this storm, and now there was no going back. But had I just made things worse for myself? I couldn't think about that now. My hands were still trembling, My wrists sore from the cuffs. I stared at the mirrored wall across from me, knowing there were people on the other side, watching, judging, waiting for me to break. I had one chance to prove my innocence. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before the door creaked open again. A different officer walked in, holding a phone. "One call," he said flatly, placing the phone on the table. "Make it count." I hesitated. Who could help me? Daniel had made sure I was isolated. I had no family in the city. Most of my friends were mutual connections with Daniel, people who probably already believed the worst about me. If I called the wrong person, I'd only make things worse. Then a name flashed in my mind. Lena. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but she had been my closest friend before Daniel had slowly pushed her out of my life. She had warned me about him once, said something about how he seemed too controlling, too perfect. I had laughed it off at the time, but maybe she had seen something I hadn't. I dialed her number, my fingers shaking. The phone rang once, twice, my breath caught in my throat. Maybe she wouldn't pick up. Maybe she had already cut me off completely. Then a click. Hello? Relief crashed over me like a wave. "Lena," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's me." There was a long pause. "Emma?" She sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was hearing right. "Yes, I need your help." Silence. Then she exhaled sharply. "I saw the news," she said, her voice colder now. "Is it true?" "No," I nearly shouted. "Lena, you know me. You know I would never do something like this." She didn't respond right away, and my stomach twisted. If she didn't believe me, no one would. Then, finally, she spoke. "I told you, Emma. I told you something was off about him." Tears burned in my eyes. "I know," I whispered. "I should have listened." Another pause. Then, softer this time, she asked, "What do you need?" Hope flared inside me. "I need to prove Daniel did this," I said quickly. "I don't have any proof, but I know he used me. I need someone on the outside to dig. Anything. Emails, bank transfers, records in his name." Lena let out a slow breath. "That's not going to be easy," she muttered. "I don't care how hard it is," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "If I don't find something, I'll go to prison for something I didn't do." Lena was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, "I'll see what I can do." I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back the rush of emotion. "Thank you," I whispered. "I don't know if I can find anything," she warned, "but if Daniel really did this, he made a mistake somewhere." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Just be careful. He's dangerous." Another pause. Then Lena sighed. "I always knew that." Before I could respond, the officer took the phone from me, ending the call. "Time's up," he said. I sat back, my heart still racing. Now all I could do was wait, and hope that Daniel had left a trail of his own destruction. A cold wave of anger and disbelief washed over me as I stared at Daniel. His presence in this room, sitting across from me like he had nothing to hide, made my skin crawl. His calm demeanour, the way he casually adjusted his cuffs, as if he were in control of the situation, only fueled the fire inside me. My hands curled into fists under the table, nails digging into my palms. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharp. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, tilting his head slightly as if I had just asked something ridiculous. "Come on, Emma," he said smoothly. "You know exactly why I'm here." I swallowed hard, refusing to let him see how much he was getting to me. "No, actually, I don't," I snapped, "because the only reason I can think of is that you're here to make sure I take the fall for your crimes." His lips twitched, just a slight movement, but enough for me to notice. I had hit a nerve. "Emma," he sighed, leaning forward slightly, "let's not do this. I came here because I wanted to see if we could work something out. A laugh bubbled in my throat, but it came out bitter and sharp. Work something out, I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. You framed me, Daniel. You stole my identity, my life, and left me to rot in a jail cell while you walked away clean. And now you want to negotiate. He exhaled slowly, as if he were tired of explaining things to me. You're making this sound worse than it is, he said. It's just business, Emma. Things got messy, but it was never personal. Never personal? Those 2 words made my blood boil. How could he sit there and say that? After everything? I leaned in, my voice low and controlled. Tell me, Daniel, was it just business when you told me you loved me? Was it just business when you made me believe we had a future together? His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, so fast that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Look, he said, his tone shifting to something softer, almost persuasive. The way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can keep fighting this, drag it out, try to convince the police that I set you up. But let's be honest, Emma, you have no proof. No one is going to believe you over me. You know that. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. Or, he continued, you can take the deal I'm about to offer you. I scoffed. A deal? You expect me to make a deal with the man who ruined my life? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple like I was being difficult. Emma, don't be stubborn. If you cooperate, I can make this all go away. You won't have to go to prison. In fact, I can get you out of here today. You just have to play along. A sharp chill ran down my spine. Play along with what? His eyes darkened slightly. Plead guilty to the charges. I felt the ground shift beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. Plead guilty? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, his expression calculated. Take the blame. Say it was all you. I've already spoken to the right people. I can make sure you only serve a minimum sentence, a couple of years at most, and in return, I'll take care of you when you get out. My hands were shaking now, but I refused to let him see my fear. You want me to ruin my own life just to save yours? He sighed again, as if my resistance was inconvenient to him. Emma, let's be realistic. You're backed into a corner. You can fight me, but it won't end well for you. Or you can be smart and take the way out I'm offering. I stared at him, my mind racing. He was bluffing. He had to be. There was no way he had everything locked down so tightly that the truth would never come out. But what if he wasn't bluffing? What if I really had no way of proving my innocence? Would I spend the rest of my life in prison trying to fight a battle I had already lost? Daniel must have sensed my hesitation because he leaned in even closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. Just say yes, Emma. Say yes, and this all goes away. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unexpected. I felt calm, because I finally understood something. Daniel wasn't here because he was confident. He wasn't here because he had won. He was here because he was scared. If he truly believed I had no way out, he wouldn't have come. He wouldn't have offered a deal. He wouldn't be pushing so hard for me to surrender, which meant I still had power, which meant I still had a way to win. I slowly leaned back in my chair, meeting his gaze head-on. A small, dangerous smile crept onto my lips. You know what, Daniel? I said softly. I think I'll take my chances. For the first time that night, his expression cracked. And that's when I knew. I had just turned the game around. Waiting felt like torture. Time moved painfully slow, the ticking of the wall clock in the interrogation room drilling into my skull. I kept replaying the phone call with Lena, overanalyzing her tone, her hesitation. Would she actually help me? Or had I put too much faith in a friendship that had already been broken? The detective still hadn't returned, and every second felt like Daniel was getting further ahead, covering his tracks, twisting the story, making sure that by the time I tried to prove the truth, it would be too late. My head snapped up when the door finally opened. The detective walked in, his face unreadable, and slid a piece of paper across the table. I stared at it, confusion mixing with the anxiety already suffocating me. "Your official charges," he said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. "Wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, all tied to accounts that lead straight back to you." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to read. My name was plastered across the document, my supposed crimes laid out in detail. It felt surreal, like reading about someone else. But the evidence said otherwise. "I didn't do this," I said, my voice hoarse. The detective leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You keep saying that, Emma, but there's nothing tying Daniel to any of this. Every document, every transaction, it all traces back to you." A sharp pain formed behind my eyes. This was exactly what Daniel wanted. He had done this so well, so flawlessly, that even if I screamed the truth at the top of my lungs, no one would believe me. But then something caught my eye. A signature at the bottom of one of the pages. My signature. Except it wasn't. Not exactly. I leaned forward, staring at it harder, my breath catching in my throat. It was close. Close enough to fool a bank, maybe even the police, but not me. I had signed my name thousands of times, and I never curved my E like that. Hope flickered inside me like a match in the dark. "This isn't my signature," I whispered. The detective sighed. "Emma, look at it," I snapped, my voice desperate now. "It's close, I'll admit that. But this isn't how I sign my name, and I can prove it." I reached for the pen sitting on the table, and with shaking hands, signed my name on the blank space of the document. Then I pushed it toward him, my heart hammering in my chest. He looked at it, then at the fake one. The room went silent. I could see the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't convinced yet, not completely, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Finally, he exhaled. "It's not enough," he said, though his voice had softened. "Even if this signature is forged, it doesn't prove Daniel did it." I clenched my fists. He was right. I needed more. The door opened again, and an officer walked in, whispering something into the detective's ear. His brows furrowed. Then, with a nod, he stood up. "Stay here," he ordered before walking out. I watched him go, confusion twisting in my gut. What was happening? Then, before I could dwell on it, the door opened again. But this time, it wasn't the detective, it was Daniel. I felt my whole body freeze. He stepped in casually, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. His confidence oozed off him like he was walking into a business meeting instead of facing the woman he had framed. His eyes met mine, and I swore I saw the slightest smirk. "Emma," he said smoothly, taking a seat across from me. "We need to talk." Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but I saw it. The tiniest crack in his perfect, unshakable mask. He wasn't expecting me to refuse. He thought he had me cornered, broken, desperate enough to grab onto the lifeline he was pretending to offer. But now he had to recalibrate, to adjust to the fact that I wasn't going to play his game. He let out a slow breath, forcing a smile as he leaned back in his chair. "Emma," he said, shaking his head like I was being childish, "don't be foolish. I'm giving you a way out. You really want to throw that away because of pride?" "Pride?" I laughed, but it was hollow. "This isn't about pride, Daniel. It's about the fact that you're lying." His smile didn't falter, but I saw the sharpness in his eyes. "What makes you think that?" "Because if you had really won," I said, tilting my head slightly, "you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't waste your time trying to convince me to take the fall. If the case against me was airtight, I'd already be rotting in a cell, and you'd be off spending your stolen money without a second thought. But instead, you're here, trying to make a deal, which means you're nervous, which means I still have a chance to bring you down." Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against the table, his only visible sign of irritation. "You've always been smart, Emma," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something colder. "That's one of the things I liked about you. But smart people also know when they're outmatched." I folded my arms, leveling him with a steady gaze. "You're right, and I also know when someone is bluffing." Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken threats. Then, suddenly, Daniel chuckled. "You always did have a way of making things difficult." He sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, have it your way." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of calm, but his movements were just a little too controlled, a little too forced. He was trying to maintain his power, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice quieter now, almost like a warning. "You're making a mistake, Emma. I was offering you a kindness, but since you don't want it, I won't offer again." "Good," I shot back, "because I wouldn't take it even if you begged." His smile flickered again, there, then gone. He turned toward the door, his steps slow, deliberate. But just as he reached for the handle, I couldn't help myself. "One last question, Daniel," I called out. He paused but didn't turn around. I leaned forward, my voice just loud enough for him to hear. "Was any of it real? Or was I just another pawn in your game?" For a second, I thought he might ignore me, but then he exhaled softly and turned his head just slightly. Not enough to face me fully, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his profile. "It was real," he murmured, "just not in the way you thought." Then, without another word, he opened the door and walked out. The second he was gone, I felt the weight of everything crash down on me. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. But beneath all of that, beneath the anger, the exhaustion, the lingering ache of betrayal, there was something else. Determination. Because Daniel had just confirmed what I already suspected. He was worried, and that meant I still had a way to win. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to push past the whirlwind of emotions. I needed a plan. I needed proof. And I had one last hope. Lena. I just had to pray that she found something. Because if she didn't, Daniel would walk away free. And I'd be the one paying for his crimes. The moment Daniel left the room, the air felt heavier, as if his presence had left behind a lingering weight. I exhaled slowly, pressing my palms against the cold metal table to steady myself. My mind was racing, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. I had stood my ground. I had refused to play his game. But that didn't mean I was safe. In fact, I had just made myself a much bigger problem for him. And if I knew Daniel, if I really knew him, he wasn't the type to leave loose ends. The detective returned a few minutes later, his eyes scanning me as he shut the door behind him. What did he want? I let out a dry laugh. What do you think? He wanted me to plead guilty and take the fall for him. The detective studied me for a long moment, and I could tell he was processing what I'd said. And I told him to go to hell, I said flatly. Something flickered in the detective's expression. Was it respect? Maybe just curiosity? But he didn't push. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me. his hands folded together. Emma, I need to be honest with you. Right now, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Every document, every financial transaction, it all points back to you. Even if we look into Daniel without solid proof, it's your word against his. And let's be real, he has money, connections, and a spotless record. He's not the one sitting in an interrogation room. I clenched my jaw, frustration bubbling in my chest. I know that. But I also know he's not as untouchable as he thinks. The detective didn't respond right away, but I could tell he was thinking. Then, as if making a decision, he leaned forward slightly. You said you signed documents without knowing what they were. I nodded. I trusted him. He made it seem like it was just routine things, joint account agreements, rental paperwork. But I never actually read them. I didn't think I had to. The detective sighed, rubbing his temple. That's how cons work, Emma. They don't start by stealing everything at once. They build trust little by little until you don't question what's happening. I swallowed hard. I need access to my emails, my bank records, everything. I need to see what he was doing while I wasn't paying attention. The detective tapped his fingers on the table, considering it. Even if I wanted to, I can't just give you that access. Your accounts are part of an active investigation. I was about to protest when the door opened again. This time, it was the officer who had given me the phone earlier. He walked in, handing the detective a note before whispering something in his ear. The detective read it, his face unreadable, and then looked at me. You've got a visitor, he said. My heart pounded. A visitor? My mind immediately went to Daniel, but no, that wouldn't make sense. He had already come to gloat. Then it hit me. Lena, the detective stood, motioning for me to follow. The cuffs had been removed earlier, but my wrists still ached from where they had dug into my skin. As I stepped into the hallway, the bright fluorescent lights made my head throb, but I ignored it. I had bigger things to worry about. We walked past rows of desks, officers typing away at their computers, phones ringing non-stop. Then, finally, we reached the visitors' area. A small room with a glass partition and a single chair on either side. And there she was. Lena. She looked different from the last time I had seen her. Maybe it was the exhaustion on her face, the worry in her eyes. Or maybe it was just the weight of everything happening between us. She stood as soon as she saw me, pressing her hands against the glass. The officer motioned for me to sit. I did, picking up the old, slightly cracked phone that was connected to her side of the glass. She did the same. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, Lena exhaled. Emma. Hearing my name from someone who actually cared made my chest tighten. Lena, I whispered, her brows furrowed. I don't have much time, but I found something. My grip tightened on the phone. What? She glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice. I got into Daniel's financial records. He tried to cover his tracks, but I found a few things he must have missed. Transfers between shell companies, offshore accounts, things that were in your name but linked back to his investments. My pulse skyrocketed. That's it. That's the proof we need. Lena shook her head quickly. It's not enough. Not yet. The problem is that the money laundering charges against you are stronger than the breadcrumbs I found on him. We need something that directly ties him to the fraud. A transaction, a signature, anything that proves he was the one pulling the strings. I ran a hand through my hair, frustration burning through me. Then, we need to keep digging. I already started, Lena said, and I think I know where to look next. But, Emma? She hesitated. If I keep going down this road, I'll be making myself a target. Daniel isn't the kind of man who lets loose ends walk away. I swallowed hard. She was right. the deeper she dug, the more danger she put herself in. And I hated that I was dragging her into this. "You don't have to do this," I said softly. Lena met my gaze, her expression firm. "Yes, I do. You were always there for me. Now it's my turn to be there for you." Tears burned in my eyes, but I blinked them away. Just be careful, okay?" She nodded. "I will. And Emma?" "Yeah?" Her lips pressed together. "Be ready, because if I find what I think I'm going to find, Daniel's empire is about to come crashing down." The officer signalled that time was up. Lena gave me one last determined look before she stood, disappearing through the door. As I sat there, gripping the phone tightly, my heart pounded with a new emotion. Hope. Daniel thought he had won. He thought I would break, that I would fold under the weight of his betrayal. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't done yet. And soon, neither was he. The moment Lena left, a new kind of energy pulsed through my veins. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was determination. Daniel had set this game up thinking he had already won, but he didn't realize something. I had just found my way back in. I was escorted back to the interrogation room, but this time I wasn't the same person who had walked in hours ago. Before, I had been desperate, lost, gasping for any shred of hope. But now I knew Daniel had made a mistake. He had covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. And Lena was going to find that crack in his foundation and rip it wide open. The detective was waiting for me when I returned, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I sat down without being told, resting my hands on the table, keeping my face blank. "You had a visitor," he said, watching me carefully. I nodded. "And she found something." His brow arched slightly, but he didn't interrupt. I leaned forward. "Daniel's been laundering money through my accounts, using my name as a shield. He's funneled funds through offshore companies, hidden transactions under legitimate business dealings. But there are gaps, mistakes." The detective studied me, fingers tapping on the table. "That's a big claim, Emma. But it's still circumstantial. If what you're saying is true, we need concrete proof linking him directly to these accounts. Otherwise, this is just speculation." I exhaled, nodding. "Lena is working on that. And if there's one thing I know about Daniel, it's that his confidence is his biggest weakness. He thinks he's untouchable. That kind of arrogance always leaves a trail." The detective was silent for a moment, then let out a long breath. "If your friend finds something substantial, we might be able to start looking into him officially. But until then, Emma, you're still the one facing charges. You understand that, right?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. I understand. But what I didn't say was that I wasn't planning on sitting back and waiting for Lena to hand me a miracle. Number I was going to fight back now. The detective stood, motioning for an officer to escort me back to the holding area. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I knew exactly what I had to do. Daniel thought he had beaten me. He thought I was helpless. He was wrong. The holding cell was small, cold, and filled with the quiet hum of desperation. A few other women sat on the benches, their faces tired and unreadable. I sat in the corner, ignoring everything around me, my mind focused on one thing only, finding a way to take Daniel down before he could bury me alive. I knew Daniel better than anyone. I knew how he operated, how he calculated every move. He wasn't reckless. Everything he did was carefully planned, designed to eliminate risks. But he also had a habit of underestimating people. He thought of himself as the smartest person in the room. And that was going to be his downfall. I needed to get inside his head, think like him. If I were Daniel, and I needed to frame someone while keeping my hands clean, What would I do? The answer hit me like a jolt of electricity. A middleman. Daniel wouldn't have been foolish enough to directly transfer money from his own accounts to mine. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace. No, he would have used a third party, someone disposable, someone he could cut ties with if things went south. The problem was I had no access to my records from inside this cell, but Daniel did. And if there was one thing I had learned from our relationship, it was that he never liked doing his own dirty work, which meant he wasn't alone in this. There were others. Maybe a fake business partner, a lawyer, an employee who had unknowingly helped him move money around. I just had to find them. I took a deep breath, my mind working in overdrive. If Lena was following the money trail, she would eventually find the connections. But I needed more than just a name. I needed a weakness. And I knew exactly where to start. Daniel's inner circle. I closed my eyes, sifting through memories, pulling out names of people he had trusted. Business partners, associates, people who had always lingered in the background of his life. There had to be someone who knew something. Then, like a lightning bolt, a name hit me. Ben Calloway. I hadn't thought about him in a long time, but now that I did, I remembered everything. He had been Daniel's right-hand man for a while, always by his side during the business meetings, always handling transactions that Daniel didn't want to get his hands dirty with. Ben was smart, but he wasn't as ruthless as Daniel. He had a tendency to crack under pressure. I had seen it before, in high-stakes situations where Daniel had to smooth things over when Ben got too nervous. And now I was willing to bet he was the weak link. If I could find a way to get to him, if Lena could dig up something connecting him to Daniel's schemes, then I had a shot. I had a real way out. The realization sent a surge of energy through me. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just waiting for fate to decide my future. I was fighting back. And if Daniel thought he had already won, well, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The longer I sat in that holding cell, the clearer everything became. Daniel thought he had built an unshakable empire, one where every loose end was tied up, every risk accounted for. But he had made one fatal mistake. He left people behind. People like Ben Calloway. People who had witnessed too much but weren't as strong as him, weren't as calculating. Ben wasn't the mastermind. He was just a pawn who knew too much. And now, he was about to become my way out. I had no way of reaching Lena, but I knew she was already digging. If I knew her like I used to, she wasn't just sitting behind a computer screen looking at numbers. No, she was hunting. And if there was dirt on Ben, she would find it. Still, I needed to stay ahead. I needed to make my next move count. The cell door creaked open, and an officer stepped inside. "Carter!" he called, nodding for me to get up. My stomach clenched. Was this it? Had they decided to formally charge me? Had Daniel already put the final nail in my coffin? I stood, ignoring the ache in my body from sitting for so long, and followed the officer out into the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a dull, washed-out glow. My pulse was steady, but my mind was anything but. Was it Lena? Had she found something? I was led to another small room. Not the interrogation room, but somewhere different. A conference room. There was a table, a single chair on one side, and a few officers standing near the door. And then I saw him. Ben Calloway. He was already sitting there, his leg bouncing anxiously under the table, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his usually neat hair slightly dishevelled. I didn't know how Lena had pulled this off, but somehow she had gotten to him. Ben looked up the moment I stepped inside, his wide, panicked eyes locking onto mine. I didn't say a word as I sat across from him. I just stared. You... His voice was barely a whisper. You're still here. I raised an eyebrow. Surprised? Ben swallowed hard, looking around as if making sure no one else was listening. I thought they would have locked you up already, that the case was airtight. I leaned forward slightly. Yeah, well, seems like the case isn't as airtight as Daniel thought. His leg bounced even faster. He was nervous. Good. I don't know anything, he blurted out, his voice cracking slightly. I wasn't part of this. I was just following orders, I cut in. Just handling small transactions for Daniel. Come on, Ben. We both know you weren't just some bystander in all of this. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped his palms on his pants. I didn't think it would come to this, he admitted. I thought it was just numbers, paperwork, nothing serious. I let out a humorless laugh. Nothing serious? Ben, I'm sitting in a police station because of what Daniel did. And guess what? If they take me down, you're next. Do you really think Daniel is going to protect you? Because I can promise you the second things get messy, he will throw you under the bus faster than you can blink. Ben's breathing grew uneven. His entire posture screamed guilt, but he was still holding on, still scared of the consequences of turning on Daniel. I had to push harder. You know what he did to me, I continued, my voice softer now. You know how he used me, how he set me up to take the fall. But here's the thing, Ben. If I go down for this, I'm not going down alone. His eyes widened slightly. If I get charged, I will drag everyone down with me, I pressed, including you. And trust me, Daniel will let it happen. He's already distanced himself from you, hasn't he? Stopped answering your calls? Told you to lay low while he handled everything? Ben swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was right. He's setting you up, Ben, I continued. Maybe not like he did with me, but close enough. You're the last link in his operation. When the walls close in, who do you think he's going to blame? Ben's hands were shaking now. He stopped himself, glancing at the officers behind me. I can't just turn on him. You don't know what he's capable of. I narrowed my eyes. Oh, I know exactly what he's capable of. That's why I need your help to stop him before it's too late. Ben hesitated, his fingers twitching. He was breaking. I could see it. I leaned in one last time. Ben, if you help me, I can help you, but you have to tell the truth. You have to give them something real. Because if you don't, Daniel walks free and you take his place as the fall guy. Silence. For a second, I thought he might shut down completely, that fear would win over logic. But then, finally, he exhaled sharply, his entire body sagging in defeat. There's a hard drive, he muttered under his breath. My heart nearly stopped. What? I whispered. Ben licked his lips, glancing at the officers again before leaning in closer. Daniel keeps records. Not the kind he shows the IRS, but the real ones. Every deal, every offshore account, every dirty transaction he's ever done. A rush of adrenaline hit me so fast, I almost felt lightheaded. This was it. Where? I demanded. Ben's voice was barely above a whisper. It's hidden in his private office, in his penthouse. Of course, Daniel always kept insurance on himself. He was smart, but he was also paranoid. He would never trust someone else to hold the real records of his crimes. If we can get that hard drive, I murmured, my mind already racing, we can prove everything. Ben nodded shakily. Yeah, but Emma... His face paled slightly. You have to be careful. If Daniel finds out what you're doing... I know, I cut him off, but I don't have a choice. Another silence stretched between us. Then Ben sighed, rubbing his face in his hands. I'll testify, he muttered. I'll tell them everything. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had him. Now, all I had to do was get to that hard drive. And Daniel? He was running out of time. Ben's confession was the first real breakthrough. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Getting the truth was one thing, proving it was another. The moment the words left his mouth, the detective sitting behind us straightened, exchanging a quick glance with the officer in the corner. They knew what this meant. This was the kind of information that could break the case wide open. The detective leaned forward. Ben, do you understand what you're saying? You're admitting to being involved in an ongoing federal crime. If we move forward with this, you'll be implicating yourself. Ben ran a hand over his face, looking pale and exhausted. I know, he muttered, but I don't have a choice, do I? I watched him closely, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger than that. If Ben was willing to talk, we had a chance to bring Daniel down for good. The detective exhaled, then stood up, motioning for another officer. Take Calloway into protective custody. We need his full statement, now. Ben swallowed hard, but didn't protest as the officer led him away. The second he was gone, the detective turned his sharp gaze on me. You got what you wanted, Emma, he said, but this isn't over. I nodded, forcing myself to stay calm. What happens now? Now. He tapped his fingers on the table. Now we verify everything. If what he said about the hard drive is true, that could be the missing link we need. A nervous knot twisted in my stomach. So, what are you waiting for? The detective sighed, crossing his arms. There's a problem, Carter. We can't just walk into Daniel's penthouse and take what we want. We need a search warrant, and that takes time. Time. I nearly laughed. Time was the one thing I didn't have. Because if Daniel so much as suspected that Ben had flipped, he would burn everything to the ground before the police even had a chance to make a move. We don't have time, I said, my voice tight. You know that. Daniel isn't stupid. The moment he realizes something's off, that hard drive will be gone. We have to get it now. The detective shook his head. That's not how the law works, Emma. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to scream. The law. That's what had gotten me here in the first place, trusting a system that had almost thrown me away without a second thought. Then let me do it, I blurted out. The detective's brows furrowed. Excuse me? Let me get the hard drive, I repeated. You're right, you can't go in without a warrant, but I can. He scoffed. You expect me to just let you walk out of here and break into Daniel's penthouse? I didn't even blink. You don't have to let me, but you and I both know that if we wait for the system to catch up, we'll lose our only chance. He stared at me for a long moment. I could tell he was considering it, even if he didn't want to admit it. Finally, he sighed. And how exactly do you plan to get inside? I hesitated, but only for a second. Daniel still thinks he has control over me. He thinks I'm scared, that I have nowhere to turn. I paused. If I go to him, act like I've changed my mind, like I want to take his deal, he'll let me in. The detective didn't look convinced. And then what? You just walk out with a hard drive in your pocket. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'll figure it out. His jaw tightened. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. If Daniel catches you, you won't just be facing fraud charges. You'll be dead. I swallowed hard. I know. Silence filled the room. Then, finally, he cursed under his breath and ran a hand through his hair. Fine, he muttered, but you're not doing this alone. I'll have an undercover unit stationed outside the building. If anything goes wrong, you signal us." Relief and fear crashed into me at the same time. This was it. I was going back to Daniel. An hour later, I was standing outside his penthouse. The familiar sight of the sleek modern building sent a chill down my spine. I had walked through these doors countless times before, wrapped up in a love that had never really existed. Now, I was stepping inside as a woman who knew the truth. I inhaled sharply, pushing the memories aside, and knocked on the door. Seconds passed. Then it opened. Daniel stood there, dressed impeccably, as always, his face unreadable. "Emma," he said smoothly, "this is a surprise." I forced a small, shaky smile. "Can we talk?" He studied me for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing me in. The moment I walked in, I could feel it. Something was off. There was an energy in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Daniel closed the door behind me, moving around me slowly. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to see you again." I folded my arms, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "I changed my mind." His brows lifted slightly. "Did you?" I nodded. "You were right. Fighting this is useless. I can't win." I exhaled, playing the part perfectly. "If I take the deal, I get a reduced sentence. If I fight you, I lose everything." Daniel studied me carefully. "And you just came to this realization?" I forced a nervous laugh. "Being locked in a cell gives you a lot of time to think." He smirked, stepping closer. "Smart girl." I swallowed my disgust and took a slow step forward. "I just need one thing first." His smirk faltered slightly. "What's that?" "I need to see the files," I said carefully. "If I'm going to take the fall, I need to know exactly what I'm pleading guilty to." The shift in his eyes was subtle, but I caught it. He knew something was wrong. "You want to see the files?" he repeated, his voice quiet. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "I just need to be sure." For a second, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, Daniel smiled. And I knew I had just made a mistake. "You almost had me," he murmured, his tone almost amused. A sharp, ice-cold fear shot through me. "Emma," he said, stepping even closer, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Did you really think you could fool me?" My mouth went dry. He knew. I barely had time to react before he grabbed my wrist. Tight. And just like that, my plan was falling apart. Daniel's grip on my wrist was like iron, cold and unrelenting. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse. He stared at me, his smirk fading into something more calculating. "You really thought you could play me?" His voice was dangerously quiet, laced with amusement and something darker, something I had never fully seen until now. For the first time, I realized just how deeply I had underestimated his cruelty. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Daniel, I just wanted to..." His fingers tightened. "Don't lie to me, Emma. I don't like being lied to." My mind raced. I needed a way out now. Then I remembered the undercover unit. The detective had promised they'd be watching. But how would they know I was in trouble? I forced a small, nervous laugh. "Okay, you caught me," I admitted, keeping my voice light. "I wasn't entirely honest. I needed to see for myself." His eyes narrowed. "See what?" I tilted my chin up slightly, meeting his gaze. "I needed to know if you ever really loved me," I whispered. His grip loosened just enough. I took my chance. With all my strength, I jerked my wrist free and stumbled backward. "Help!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, knowing the undercover officers were outside. I didn't know if they could hear me, but I had to try. Daniel's face changed. The mask slipped completely, and for the first time, I saw him for what he really was. Not a charming businessman, not the man I had once loved, but a predator who had finally lost control of his prey. He lunged for me, but before he could touch me, the front door burst open. "Daniel Reeves!" The detective's voice rang out sharp and commanding. "Step away from her!" In seconds, the room was filled with officers, guns drawn, voices shouting. Daniel froze. For the first time, he looked afraid. The realization hit him too late. He had lost. "Emma," he started, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You don't have to do this." I stared at him, my chest heaving, my heart still hammering in my ribs. "You did this to yourself," I said, my voice steady. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he didn't fight as the officers grabbed him, forcing his hands behind his back. The sound of handcuffs locking around his wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. As they dragged him toward the door, he turned his head, one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You'll regret this, Emma," he warned. "You think this is over." I took a slow breath. "No," I said, "but you are." And just like that, Daniel was gone. Days later, the sun was warm against my skin as I stepped outside, a free woman. The case had unraveled quickly after Daniel's arrest. With Ben's testimony and the hard drive recovered from his office, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had nowhere to hide. I had expected to feel relief, and I did. But more than that, I felt stronger. Daniel had tried to take everything from me, my freedom, my future, my identity, but I had taken something more important from him, his power. Lena stood by my side, grinning. "So," she said, nudging me, "what now?" I smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting off my shoulders. "Now," I said, "I start over. And this time I wouldn't be looking back. Thank you all for listening to this story with our channel. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to motivate us to bring more interesting stories. Much love to all of you.